Chapter 1. The dead man on top of her was still warm. That was the worst part. The blood soaking through Naevia's tunic belonged to a gladiator who had been breathing 3 minutes ago, and now, his lifeless weight was the only thing hiding her from the royal pack. The forest was unnaturally still. Then, a massive snout shoved the corpse aside. Cold moonlight flooded Naevia's vision. A gray wolf, large enough to crush a horse, stared down at her, its jaws dripping. Naevia didn't scream. She didn't scramble backward. Instead, she let out a soft, breathy laugh. The wolf paused, confused by the lack of fear. In that split second, Naevia drove a splintered bone pulled from the very corpses around her straight upward into its left eye. The beast thrashed backward, its deafening howl shattering the night. Naevia stood up, brushing the dirt from her knees. She held the bloody bone fragment loosely at her side, tilting her head as the rest of the pack circled her. Suddenly, the air pressure dropped so violently her ears popped. The remaining wolves stopped snarling. They didn't just back away. Their legs gave out. Massive, bloodthirsty beasts dropped to their bellies, pressing their throats into the mud in absolute, terrified submission. Footsteps, slow, precise. A man stepped out of the tree line. He didn't just enter the clearing, he erased the oxygen in it. Broad shoulders, obsidian black hair, and eyes that burned with a sick golden light. Vokkar, the Alpha King. "You don't run," he noted. His voice was a flat, lethal rumble. "Running is boring," Naevia said. She didn't raise her weapon. She just stared at him. Vokkar stepped fully into the moonlight. His golden eyes locked onto her face, scanning her dirt-streaked features before freezing on her eyes. Violet, the color of the prophesied end. A chilling predatory smile curved Vokkar's lips. It was the look of a man who had finally found the tumor he needed to cut out. So the curse breathes. "Are you the executioner?" Naevia asked, her tone entirely too conversational for a girl about to die. "Or just the dog they sent to fetch me?" Vokkar didn't blink. He vanished. He was a blur of violence. Before Naevia could even twitch, his massive hand clamped around her throat. He slammed her against the nearest oak tree so hard the bark cracked. "I am the cure," he whispered. Naevia didn't fight him. That was her first mistake. Or perhaps, her masterstroke. She went completely limp, forcing him to hold her dead weight, her bloody hands draped lazily over his thick wrists, her blood smearing directly against his bare skin. The second her blood soaked into his pores, reality fractured. Vokkar stopped breathing. A catastrophic shockwave hijacked his brain. The forest vanished. He saw a throne made of screaming ash. He saw himself on his knees, the great obsidian king weeping, his chest ripped completely open, begging the girl before him to tear out his heart and end it. And Naevia? She stood over his ruined body, wearing a crown of suffocating, shifting shadows. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, staring into the absolute void, completely indifferent to his suffering. Vokkar gasped, violently pulled back to the present. The air around him smelled like ozone and rotting earth. His inner wolf, the apex predator of the continent, went entirely, unnaturally silent. It didn't want to claim her. It wanted to dig a hole and bury itself. Mate. The realization felt like a terminal diagnosis. "What are you?" Vokkar hissed, the gold in his eyes glitching wildly. His hand trembled against her throat. Naevia's face was turning pale from the lack of oxygen, but that unsettling, broken smile returned to her lips. She leaned into his grip, her violet eyes shining with dark amusement. "Do it," she croaked, her voice barely a whisper. "Break it. Let's see what happens." Most alphas would drop to their knees. Most alphas would surrender to the biological command of the bond. Vokkar let out a harsh, unhinged laugh. "Gladly," he whispered. The madness in his eyes eclipsed the gold. He chose to be the monster. He chose to defy the gods. He tightened his grip, fully intending to snap his mate's neck and end the nightmare. The bone in Naevia's neck began to groan. She didn't break eye contact. She just kept smiling. Suddenly, a horrific, tearing sound echoed in Vokkar's own ears. A searing, wet pain slashed across his throat. Vokkar choked, his fingers spasming. His grip loosened just enough for Naevia to take a ragged gasp of air. He kept her pinned, but his left hand instinctively shot to his own neck. His fingers came back slick and dark red. His own skin was splitting open. The harder he squeezed her, the deeper his own flesh tore. The world tilted. His heart slammed against his ribs in an erratic, dying rhythm, a rhythm that perfectly matched the pulse fluttering under his hand on Naevia's throat. Then, a voice exploded in his mind through the telepathic pack link. "Vokkar, stop!" It was Bastion, his royal healer, raw panic bleeding through the connection. "I can feel your life force dropping. Look at your neck." Vokkar stared in sheer, absolute horror at the bleeding, smiling girl in his grasp. "The bondish a mirror." "Vokkar." Bastion's voice dropped to a terrified whisper in his head. "She isn't just your mate, she is a parasite. If you stop her heart, yours bursts." Chapter 2. 1, 2, 3. Naevia whispered the numbers into the cold, polished stone of the floor. She wasn't counting the seconds. She was counting the violent, erratic thumps of the Alpha King's heart. She could feel them vibrating inside her own ribs, a parasitic, inescapable rhythm. Vokkar hauled her up by the back of her torn collar, dragging her into the center of his private chambers. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, sealing out the chaotic shouts of his pack. He didn't speak. His breathing was heavy, ragged. He grabbed a heavy chain from the stone wall forged of pure, magic-suppressing silver and locked the shackle roughly around her left wrist. The metal hissed. Smoke curled upward as the silver burned directly into her skin. Vokkar stepped back, expecting her to collapse. Instead, Naevia tilted her head, her violet eyes locked onto his. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her free right hand and wrapped her bare fingers completely around the glowing hot silver chain. She squeezed, hard. The sickening sound of searing flesh echoed in the quiet room. Vokkar let out a sudden violent gasp. His knees buckled. He crashed to the stone floor, his hands flying to his own wrists. Vicious, angry red blisters were exploding across his skin, perfectly mirroring the catastrophic damage Naevia was actively inflicting on herself. "Stop!" Vokkar gritted out, his golden eyes wide with shock. Naevia didn't let go. The sickening, broken smile returned to her lips. She stepped closer to the kneeling king, dragging the burning chain with her. "You think you locked me up?" she whispered, her voice dangerously soft. "Look at you, bleeding, kneeling. I decide when we hurt, Vokkar. I decide when we die. I've seen you drag back a lot of things from the hunting grounds." A dry, amused voice drawled from the shadows of the room. Thane, the king's shadow, stepped into the candlelight. His arms were crossed, his expression unreadable as his eyes flicked from the smiling girl holding the burning metal to his alpha gasping on the floor. "But I've never seen you give the leash to the prisoner," Thane noted. "A bold new strategy, Your Majesty." "Get out, Thane," Vokkar snarled, struggling to stand. The pain was blinding. "The lords are demanding her head," Thane warned, not moving. "You brought the purple-eyed curse into the citadel. They want a public execution. Tonight. If they touch her, I die," Vokkar commanded, his voice a lethal whip crack. "Secure the perimeter. No one enters this tower." Thane stared at his alpha for a long, calculating second. Then, he looked at Naevia. "Try not to kill him before I get back," Thane muttered, turning on his heel and locking the heavy doors from the outside. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vokkar lunged forward, his massive hands wrapping around Naevia's, violently peeling her fingers off the silver chain. The second she let go, the blinding pain in his own wrists subsided into a dull, throbbing ache. He didn't let her step back. He pinned her against the heavy oak table, his chest heaving. He grabbed a small glass jar of black healing salve, his golden eyes burning with unfiltered rage. "I will put you in a chemically induced coma," Vokkar threatened, his face mere inches from hers. "I will lock you in a glass box and feed you through a tube for the rest of my natural life if you try that again." "Do it," Naevia challenged, leaning in so close her nose brushed his cheek. "Let's see if your beast lets you put its mate in a box." Vokkar froze. Her proximity was devastating. The bond slammed into them, both a violent magnetic crash. It wasn't the warm pull of destined lovers. It was the terrifying gravity of a black hole. His beast purred in his chest, desperate to submit, while his logical mind screamed in panic. His hand trembled as he pressed the black salve against the torn skin of her throat. As the medicine knit her flesh back together, the gash on Vokkar's own neck closed. He let out a ragged sigh of relief, his eyes fluttering shut for a fraction of a second. Crash. The high stained glass window exploded inward. A shower of razor-sharp glass rained down on them, but Vokkar didn't look at the glass. His heightened senses caught the high-pitched whistle of displaced air, a heavy crossbow bolt, fired from the outer courtyard. Time slowed. Naevia saw it. The black-fletched arrow was aimed dead center at her chest. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. Her violet eyes lit up with sudden, manic triumph. And out. If it hit her, they both died. The curse would end. The monster holding her would fall. Naevia didn't step back. She lunged forward, opening her arms to catch the lethal projectile. Vokkar realized her insane intent a microsecond too late. No, he didn't just jump in front of her. He launched his massive body at her like a battering ram, violently tackling her to the stone floor to rip her out of the arrow's path. They hit the ground hard. Thwack. The sickening sound of metal punching through flesh and bone echoed in the room. Vokkar let out a guttural, choked grunt. His entire body went rigid above her. Naevia's breath hitched. Her skull throbbed from the impact with the floor. She looked past his broad shoulder. The black shaft of the arrow was buried deep into Vokkar's upper back. He had stopped her from killing them both, but he took the hit to do it. Black, thick liquid began to seep through his torn shirt, sizzling against his skin. "Vokkar?" Naevia whispered. For the first time her voice lost its mocking edge. He didn't answer. His golden eyes rolled back. Violent black veins began rapidly spreading up his neck from the wound, crawling toward his face like spiderwebs. Poison. Wolfsbane mixed with dark magic. Vokkar's head dropped heavily onto her shoulder. His breath was a shallow, terrifying rattle. As his body began to convulse, his massive hand blindly grasped her shirt, his grip weak but desperate. "Don't," Vokkar choked out, dark blood spilling from his lips onto her collar. "Don't you dare stop breathing." And then, the Alpha King went entirely limp. Chapter 3. "Get off me," Naevia hissed. She shoved her hands against the immovable wall of muscle, crushing her against the stone floor. He didn't move. Vokkar's dead weight was suffocating. The black veins crawling up his neck were pulsing thick, unnatural and spreading fast. The heavy oak doors of the chamber didn't just open. They were violently blasted off their iron hinges. A man strode through the splintered wood. No armor. Messy, pale hair. A healer's satchel slung over one shoulder. Bastion didn't look terrified. He looked profoundly annoyed. "I leave the perimeter for 10 minutes, Bastion muttered, dropping to his knees beside them. He jumped in front of a poisoned arrow, Naevia stated, her voice entirely flat. "Your king is an idiot. He's an alpha. Biological imperative overrules logic," Bastion replied. He gripped the black shaft of the arrow and ripped it out of Vokkar's back in one brutal, fluid motion. Black liquid splattered the stone, hissing and eating into the rock like acid. Bastion pressed his bare, glowing hands against the open wound. The golden healing magic flared for a fraction of a second before it instantly fizzled out, turning a sickly, dying gray. Bastion swore under his breath, sitting back on his heels. "Shadowbane, mixed with something ancient. My magic can't touch it. It's actively devouring his life force." "Good," Naevia said, offering a cold, sharp smile. "Take this silver chain off my wrist. I'll let myself out." Bastion looked at her like she was the stupidest creature in the realm. "Did you forget the parasitic loop he triggered in the forest? You are biologically tethered, if his heart stops." Bastion pointed a finger directly at her chest. "Yours explodes. You die with him, girl." Naevia's smile vanished. The reality of the trap closed around her throat. "What do you want me to do?" she snapped, glaring at the dying king. "Anchor him," Bastion ordered, his voice shifting from lazy to lethal. "The poison is killing his human side, but his inner wolf can burn the toxin out if it has a reason to stay in this world. I am not his reason to stay. I am his executioner. Right now, you are his life support," Bastion corrected coldly. "He needs the mate bond. He needs your scent, your energy, your absolute submission. Give it to him, or we both watch you die in 5 minutes." Naevia stared at Vokkar's ashen face. His breathing was a shallow, wet rattle. The violent thumping of his heart, the rhythm she felt in her own chest, was skipping beats, fading. She hated him. She hated the bond. But she refused to die on the floor of a prison cell. Naevia grabbed the collar of Vokkar's ruined shirt and hauled his heavy torso upward. She leaned in so close their noses brushed. "Listen to me, you stubborn beast," she whispered directly against his lips. "If you die right now and take me with you, I swear to the gods I will drag your soul out of the afterlife just to kill you myself." She didn't wait for a response. She crashed her lips against his. It wasn't a kiss of true love. It was a violent, desperate collision of survival. The second their mouths connected, the temperature in the room plummeted to freezing. The air pressure snapped. Vokkar's body violently convulsed. His eyes snapped open. They weren't gold anymore. They were completely, terrifyingly black, the absolute void of an apex predator taking control. He didn't pull away. He took over. Vokkar's massive hands shot up, tangling into Naevia's hair, holding her skull in a brutal, inescapable grip. He kissed her back with a dominating, possessive ferocity that stole the oxygen directly from her lungs. He was consuming her breath, her energy, drawing the raw power of the Void Queen into his own collapsing veins to burn the poison alive. Naevia gasped against his mouth, a sudden blinding pain shooting behind her eyes. She felt it, the seal inside her soul cracking. As Vokkar ruthlessly drank from the bond, her violet eyes began to glow. A blinding, pulsing purple light bled from her pupils, illuminating the dark room. The stone floor beneath them began to vibrate. Then, the entire castle violently shook. Cracks spider-webbed up the heavy stone walls. The glass from the broken window lifted off the floor, suspended in mid-air by a crushing wave of anti-gravity. Vokkar's black veins began to rapidly recede, entirely burned out by the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of her awakening magic. "Enough!" Bastian shouted, shielding his face from the blinding violet light. "Pull back! You're overloading him!" They couldn't. The bond had locked them together in a vicious cycle of energy. Boom. A shockwave of pure, purple energy blasted outward from Naevia's body, shattering every remaining mirror and glass object in the tower. Heavy footsteps pounded down the stone hallway. Calith, the head jailer and lead warrior, skidded to a halt in the destroyed doorway. Her armor was covered in dust, her eyes wide with unprecedented panic as she stared at the king pinning the glowing girl to the floor. "What the hell did you two just do?" Calith screamed over the roaring wind inside the room. Bastian stumbled to his feet. "I told her to heal him." "She didn't just heal him," Calith roared, pointing a trembling, gauntleted finger out the shattered window toward the northern mountains. "Look!" Through the broken glass, the sky was tearing open. A massive, shimmering dome of golden magic that had protected the kingdom's borders for 1,000 years was visibly fracturing into 1,000,000 pieces. "The seal!" Calith gasped, her voice entirely stripped of its usual bravado. The barrier holding back the abyssal beasts in the north, it just shattered. Chapter 4. "Burn her." Lord Kalen didn't shout. He whispered the command like a prayer. Naevia was forced to her knees in the center of the great hall, her silver chains anchored to a heavy iron ring in the floor. Kalen stood over her, his face a mask of serene, terrifying calm. He wasn't a raving lunatic, he was a fanatic, and fanatics didn't hesitate. He held a blazing torch, the flames reflecting in his dead, cold eyes. "The northern barrier is shattered," Kalen addressed the silent, terrified Council of Lords. "The abyssal beasts are flooding our borders. The purple-eyed curse breathes in our hall. The fire is not punishment. It is a mercy for the world." Kalen lowered the torch toward Naevia's hair. Naevia didn't flinch. She looked at the flames and let out a soft, bored sigh. "Are you going to talk me to death, old man? Or are you going to drop it?" Before Kalen could react, a massive hand clamped around his wrist. The heat in the room instantly vanished, replaced by the suffocating, freezing pressure of absolute alpha authority. Vokkar stood there. He was deathly pale, his dark tunic hiding the catastrophic, weeping wound on his neck. He looked physically ruined, yet his presence alone forced 3 lords in the front row to drop to their knees, gasping for air. "You don't burn my property, Kalen," Vokkar stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. He crushed Kalen's wrist until the bones popped. The torch clattered to the stone floor. Kalen didn't scream. He simply stepped back, rubbing his arm. "She is the prophecy, Your Majesty. The law of the first alphas demands her life. The law dictates the destruction of anomalies," Vokkar agreed smoothly, stepping over the torch and stopping directly in front of Naevia. "Unless the anomaly belongs to the crown." The great hall went dead silent. "She is a pit slave," Kalen stated flatly. You cannot take her as a mate. I never said she was my mate. Vokkar's voice echoed with cruel, practiced detachment. She is a blood slave, a concubine. Her body, her magic, and her breath are the exclusive property of the obsidian throne. She is my toy. You do not break my toys. Vokkar waited for Naevia to snap. He expected her to fight him, to curse him for stripping away her dignity in front of the most powerful men in the realm. He needed her to play the victim so he could play the tyrant. Instead, Naevia started laughing. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was dark, amused, and utterly unhinged. She tilted her head back, looking upside down at Kaelin with a sickeningly sweet smile. Did you hear that, my lord? I'm his favorite whore. Untouchable. Vokkar's breath hitched. She was weaponizing his own lie. Naevia turned her violet eyes up to Vokkar. She deliberately pushed her heavy hair over her shoulder, completely exposing the fragile, pale skin of her neck. Go on, your majesty, she purred, her voice dripping with dangerous mockery. Stake your claim. Show the dogs who holds my leash. Bite me. Vokkar's jaw locked. The sheer audacity of her defiance made his inner wolf roar a violently confusing mix of fury and intense possessive arousal. He dropped to one knee, grabbing the back of her head. He didn't do it gently. He forced her face to the side, leaning in until his lips brushed her ear. You are insane, he breathed. And you are out of time, she whispered back. Vokkar's fangs descended. He bit down hard into the juncture of her neck and shoulder. Naevia gasped, her back arching. The second his teeth pierced her flesh, the parasitic bond violently ignited. The scent of ozone, rain, and suffocating dark magic exploded across the great hall. It wasn't a romantic marking. It was a brutal, public collision of power. Vokkar pulled back, wiping a smear of her blood from his bottom lip. He stood up, turning his golden, murderous glare on the council. She is mine, Vokkar commanded. If any man in this room speaks to her, I will personally separate his head from his spine. The lords swallowed hard, bowing their heads in submission. Except for Kaelin. Kaelin smiled. It was a small, knowing, terrifying smile. A bold claim, my king. But a collar does not tame a god. Kaelin snapped his fingers. The heavy iron doors at the back of the hall violently burst open. The temperature in the room plummeted below freezing. 4 heavily armored guards were dragging a massive iron cage into the room, their boots slipping on the frost forming on the stone floor. Inside the cage was a nightmare of shifting, jagged shadows and hollow glowing eyes. An Abyssal Beast. An Abyssal Beast knows its true master, Kaelin said softly, pulling a heavy hammer from his belt. If she is just a slave, it will tear her to pieces. If she is the Void Queen, it will not. Kaelin struck the locking mechanism. No! Vokkar roared, lunging forward. But he was too slow. The iron doors flew open. The shadow beast exploded out of the cage like a cannonball of darkness. It bypassed the guards entirely. It didn't even look at Vokkar. It slammed directly into Naevia. The sheer force of the impact crushed her flat against the stone floor. The beast's massive shadowy claws pinned her shoulders down. Its jaws lined with rows of jagged black teeth snapped open mere inches from her face. Black, acidic saliva dripped from its maw, landing on Naevia's cheek. The skin instantly hissed and blistered. Naevia! Vokkar screamed. He grabbed the beast's shadowy hide, tearing his own hands to shreds trying to physically rip the monster off her. The beast just swatted him away like a fly, sending the weakened king crashing into a stone pillar. The monster lowered its head, opening its jaws to rip her throat out. The entire court held its breath. Kaelin's eyes were wide with religious awe. Naevia didn't close her eyes. She didn't scream. She stared directly into the hollow, glowing eyes of the beast. She let the acidic saliva burn her. She let the absolute terror of the moment soak into the bones of every single lord watching. Then, her violet eyes flooded with pitch-black darkness. You're drooling on me, Naevia whispered. She didn't shout. She simply spoke one word in a language that hadn't been heard in a millennia. A language that made the stone foundation of the castle groan in agony. Kneel. The beast froze. Its jaws snapped shut. The massive monster let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. Its shadowy body violently shuddered before it collapsed entirely. It slid off Naevia's body, pressing its massive, terrifying snout completely flat against the floor. trembling in absolute unconditional submission at her feet. Chapter 5. The silence in the Great Hall was deafening. The Abyssal Beast, a nightmare that had terrorized the northern borders for centuries, was whimpering like a beaten dog, its massive snout pressed completely flat against the stone floor at Naevia's feet. Lord Kalen stared at the creature. The torch he had dropped was still burning on the floor, casting long, frantic shadows across his pale face. "The Void Queen," Kalen breathed, his voice cracking with religious terror. "She has awakened." Naevia didn't look at Kalen. She was staring at her own hands. The veins under her pale skin were glowing with a sickening, pulsing purple light. It didn't feel like magic. It felt like an addiction, an overwhelming, intoxicating rush of absolute power that demanded to consume everything in the room. "Kill her!" Kalen shrieked, drawing his broadsword. "Kill the queen before she opens the gates!" The 12 lords and the heavily armored guards drew their weapons in unison. The sound of steel ringing in the hall broke the spell. They charged. No. A terrifying roar shook the very foundation of the castle. Vokkar didn't just step between Naevia and the charging army. He erupted. The Obsidian King didn't bother fully shifting into his wolf form. He let his beast bleed into his human skin, his nails elongated into razor-sharp obsidian claws. His golden eyes flared with blind, possessive fury. He caught the first guard by the chest plate and threw him halfway across the great hall. The heavy armor crumpled upon impact with a stone pillar. Vokkar spun, dodging a lethal swing from a lord, and drove his fist into the man's ribs, sending him crashing to the floor. He was poisoned. He was bleeding from the neck. He was physically dying. Yet, he fought with the catastrophic force of a natural disaster, a one-man meat grinder standing between his kingdom and the girl behind him. "Vokkar!" Naevia shouted. She could feel his pulse through the bond. It wasn't a steady rhythm anymore. It was a frantic, failing drumbeat. Every time he swung, every time he used his alpha strength, his life force plummeted. Kalen saw the king falter. He snatched a heavy silver spear from a fallen guard. "For the realm!" Kalen roared, hurling the silver spear directly at Naevia's chest. It was moving too fast. Vokkar was too far away. Naevia's survival instinct, the ancient buried entity inside her, snapped awake. She didn't think. She just raised her hands. A massive shockwave of pure, black, kinetic energy exploded from her palms. But Vokkar didn't let the spear reach her. Using the absolute last fraction of his speed, Vokkar threw his massive body directly into the path of the weapon. The spear didn't hit him. Naevia's shadow blast did. The impact was catastrophic. The pure void energy slammed flush into Vokkar's chest. The sickening, undeniable crunch of 3 thick ribs snapping echoed through the chaotic hall. Vokkar was hurled backward like a rag doll. He crashed violently onto the iron dais of his own throne and rolled onto the stone floor, completely motionless. "No!" Naevia screamed. The violet light vanished from her eyes, replaced by sheer panic. She scrambled across the floor, her chains dragging behind her, and fell to her knees beside him. The remaining lords froze. The Abyssal Beast melted back into the shadows and fled through the shattered doors, terrified of the blast. Naevia grabbed Vokkar's shoulders. He was coughing up dark, oxygen-starved blood. His golden eyes were dim, flickering like a dying candle. "You idiot," she choked out, her hands hovering over his ruined chest. "Why did you jump? I had it! I stopped the spear!" Vokkar gripped her wrist. His fingers were ice cold. You can't use it," he rasped, blood staining his teeth. "Stop talking," she ordered, her voice trembling. She pressed her hands against his chest, trying to use the bond to push energy back into him, just like she had in the bedroom. But the energy didn't flow to him. It flowed from him. Naevia gasped. A sudden, terrifying clarity hijacked her brain. As Vokkar lay dying, bleeding out from her own attack, she felt her own body growing stronger. The purple glow in her veins was feeding on his fading heartbeat. It wasn't a two-way connection. It was a siphon. She looked at the massive iron throne above them. She looked at the silver chains binding her wrists, chains that burned her, but burned him just as badly. She looked at the gash on his neck that mirrored hers. The history of the world unraveled in her mind in a span of 3 seconds. The Obsidian Kings weren't conquerors. The Alphas of the North weren't placed here to rule. They were placed here to guard. "You're the lock," Naevia whispered, the horror dawning on her pale face. Vokkar didn't deny it. He just stared at her, his breathing ragged. "The mate bond," she continued, her voice dropping to a terrified, breathless pitch. "It's not destiny. It's a biological trap. The ancestors didn't curse me. They cursed you. Every time my heart beats, it drains yours. My awakening is your execution. It's my duty," Vokkar choked out. He tried to sit up, but the broken ribs forced him back down with a wet groan. "To keep you contained, to die, if the seal breaks." Naevia stared at her hands, the hands that had just shattered his chest, the hands that were currently drinking his life force to fuel her own ascension. She wasn't the victim of a cruel alpha king. She wasn't a slave trapped in a gilded cage. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "You didn't hide me in your bedroom to torture me," Naevia whispered, the devastating truth finally snapping into place. "You claimed me in front of them. You chained me to your bed." A single tear cut through the dirt and blood on her cheek. "Because I am the monster, and you are trying to stop me from ending the world." Vokkar reached up with a trembling, blood-stained hand. He didn't grab her throat this time. He cupped her cheek, his thumb smearing the tear. "And I am failing," he whispered. His hand went limp, dropping heavily to the stone floor. Vokkar's eyes rolled back, and the Alpha King stopped breathing. Chapter 6. Breathe. The command was a harsh, ragged rasp in the pitch-black darkness. Naevia squeezed her eyes shut. She pressed her spine flat against the freezing stone wall of the abyssal dungeon. She clamped her hands over her nose and mouth, violently refusing to take in oxygen. She was trying to suffocate herself, trying to force her heart rate down to stop the parasitic siphon from ripping the remaining life out of the man across the room. "Naevia, look at me." She didn't. A sickening crack echoed in the cell, followed by the heavy thud of iron tearing out of solid stone. Naevia's eyes snapped open. Bastian had chained them to opposite walls, warning them that proximity would accelerate the drain. But Vokkar wasn't waiting to die. The Obsidian King had just ripped his own mooring ring straight out of the dungeon wall. He was dragging himself toward her. His chest was tightly bound in blood-soaked bandages. Every breath he took was a wet, terrifying rattle against his shattered ribs. He looked physically ruined, yet his golden eyes burned with an unhinged predatory obsession. "Stop!" Naevia panicked, her voice cracking as she finally gasped for air. "Don't move. The closer you get, the faster I drain you." "Then drain me," Vokkar gritted out. He took another step. The heavy chains attached to his wrists dragged loudly across the stone. "Stay away from me, Vokkar. I am the monster. I am the reason you're dying." "You think you're the first monster I've conquered?" he mocked, his voice a low, lethal rumble. He reached the end of his shattered chain and dropped heavily to his knees directly in front of her. Naevia pressed harder against the wall, sobbing. She could feel the sickening pull inside her chest. The purple glow in her veins flared violently, hungrily tearing the remaining heat from his body. "The ancestors cursed you to be my leash," she screamed, hitting her own chest. "You're programmed to die if I wake up. Stop fighting it." "Fuck the ancestors," Vokkar snarled. He lunged forward, ignoring the catastrophic pain in his chest, and grabbed her face with both hands. The second his skin touched hers, a brutal hiss echoed in the damp cell. The void energy pulsing under Naevia's skin physically scorched his palms. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Vokkar didn't flinch. He didn't let go. He dug his fingers into her hair, forcing her to look at him. "I am the king of the north. I do not die because a 1,000-year-old prophecy tells me to," he whispered maliciously. "And I sure as hell don't die just to let you walk away. Vokkar, please let go, you're burning." "Listen to me," he commanded, his golden eyes fracturing with black veins. "They built me to be your lock, so I am locking myself inside you." Naevia's violet eyes widened in sheer terror as she realized his intent. "No, don't." He didn't give her a choice. Vokkar crashed his lips against hers. It wasn't a kiss of surrender. It was an invasion. It was a violent, desperate weaponization of the mate bond. Vokkar didn't try to stop the siphon. He forcefully inverted it. Naevia choked, her eyes flying wide open as a blinding, agonizing heat shot down her throat. Vokkar was ripping his own alpha spark, his soul, his magic, his absolute essence straight out of his chest and shoving it violently down the bond, directly into the pitch-black core of her void magic. He was intentionally corrupting her power with his own. "Take it," he growled against her mouth, his body convulsing as he hollowed himself out. "Vokkar, stop!" she screamed against his lips, clawing desperately at his broad shoulders. "It's tearing you apart." "If I die," he gasped, blood spilling over his chin as he pulled back just an inch. His golden eyes were flickering, dying, but his smile was terrifyingly possessive. "You are taking my ghost with you." The shockwave hit them both. Vokkar's massive chest violently caved in as the last drop of his life force was violently ripped away. The golden light in his eyes didn't just fade, it shattered like glass, leaving behind a horrifying empty darkness. All of his massive weight suddenly crashed against Naevia, pinning her to the stone floor. The parasitic rhythm inside her chest abruptly stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was a catastrophic vacuum. Naevia's body violently rejected the sudden severing of the bond. She arched off the stone floor, a horrific, tearing pain ripping through her skull. She opened her mouth to scream, but instead, she choked, violently throwing up a mouthful of pitch-black blood. The bond was dead, but his alpha aura was now burning like a radioactive core deep inside her chest. She shoved his heavy, lifeless body off her, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "Vokkar?" she gasped, wiping the dark blood from her mouth. She grabbed his face, ice cold. She pressed her ear to his shattered chest. Absolute silence. He hadn't just died. He had deliberately infected her soul with his own, making sure that as long as the Void Queen lived, she would never, ever be entirely alone. Chapter 7. His heart was silent, but he was still screaming in her head. Naevia knelt on the freezing stone floor, her hands buried in Vokkar's blood-soaked shirt. The physical silence of the cell was absolute, but inside her chest, a catastrophic war was raging. Vokkar's alpha soul, golden, furious, and fiercely possessive, was violently tearing through the pitch-black void of her magic. It burned like a swallowed star. He had permanently anchored his ghost to her core. She couldn't cry. The sheer magnitude of the energy coursing through her veins completely obliterated her human grief. "You arrogant bastard," Naevia whispered, her voice vibrating with unnatural layered distortion. "You think you can just live inside my head?" A heavy explosion shook the ceiling above. The magical seal on the dungeon door shattered. The heavy iron doors were blasted off their hinges, crashing to the floor. A blinding wash of torchlight flooded the pitch-black cell. Lord Kalen marched into the room, flanked by 6 heavily armored alpha guards. Kalen wasn't smiling. His face was a mask of grim, fanatical resolve. He looked past Naevia and saw the massive, lifeless body of the Obsidian King. The guards hesitated. They smelled the death. "The lock is broken," Kalen announced, his voice devoid of pity. He didn't mourn his king. He merely confirmed a tactical reality. "The king has fallen to the curse." "He didn't fall," Naevia said. She didn't look up at them. She kept her eyes on Vokkar's pale face. "He jumped." "It makes no difference," Kalen stated coldly. He turned to his men. "Drench her in oil. Burn the room. Do not let the queen take her first breath." 2 guards stepped forward, carrying heavy iron urns. Before they could cross the threshold, a silver blade cut through the torchlight, severing the first guard's spear in half. Thane stepped out from the shadows of the stairwell. His dark coat was torn, and blood dripped from a nasty cut above his eye, proving he had already fought his way down here. "The king ordered a lockdown, Kalen," Thane drawled. His tone was casual, but his grip on his sword was white-knuckled. "The king is dead, Thane," Kalen replied flatly. "Stand aside. You are a shadow. You have no master now." "I have my orders," Thane countered. He didn't look at Kalen. He looked past the guards, his eyes locking onto Naevia. He saw the pitch-black blood on her chin. He saw the terrifying, dual-colored glow pulsing under her skin, violet and gold. "He bet his life, his crown, and his soul on you," Thane said directly to Naevia, his voice losing its usual cynical edge. "Do not make him look like a fool." Kalen didn't wait. "Subdue him." 4 alpha guards rushed Thane at once. He fought brutally, but the confined space was against him. A heavy gauntlet smashed into his jaw, and a silver-laced net was thrown over him, pinning him violently against the stone wall. The anti-magic mesh hissed against his skin, incapacitating him immediately. Thane gritted his teeth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a scream. Kalen stepped over the struggling shadow and approached Naevia. "You cannot stop the Dawn Demon," Kalen whispered. He grabbed one of the oil urns from his guard and poured the thick, highly flammable liquid directly over Naevia's head. It soaked her hair, her clothes, and the heavy silver chains binding her. Naevia didn't move. She didn't fight back. She just closed her eyes. "For the realm," Kalen chanted. He dropped the burning torch into her lap. The fire erupted instantly. A massive pillar of violent orange flames swallowed Naevia whole. The heat was blinding, forcing Kalen and his guards to stagger backward, shielding their faces. The roaring sound of the inferno drowned out everything else in the cell. "It is done," Kalen breathed, lowering his hand. But the screaming didn't start. The fire roared, but the girl inside it was entirely silent. Suddenly, the temperature in the dungeon didn't rise. It plummeted. Frost rapidly crawled up the stone walls, completely freezing the damp air. Kalen's eyes widened in horror. Inside the inferno, the color of the flames was changing. The bright natural orange was violently fracturing. Veins of gold, Vokkar's signature alpha magic, streaked through the fire, immediately followed by a wave of suffocating pitch-black darkness. The fire turned completely black. It didn't burn her, it crowned her. Naevia stood up inside the column of black fire. Crack. The heavy, magic-suppressing silver chains around her wrists didn't just break. They instantly disintegrated into fine, gray dust, completely destroyed by the sheer, catastrophic magnitude of her power. She stepped out of the flames. The fire didn't stay behind. It clung to her, trailing from her fingertips and the hem of her ruined dress like a living, shifting cloak of shadows. Her violet eyes were gone. They were pure, endless voids of black space, with a terrifying ring of alpha gold burning around her pupils. The guards dropped their weapons. 2 of them fell to their knees, weeping uncontrollably. Their biological instincts completely short-circuited under the crushing weight of a living god. Kalen stumbled backward, his religious fanaticism finally cracking. "No, the fire was supposed to purify. You wanted to see the end of the world, Kalen." Naevia's voice echoed off the walls. It was her voice, but the terrifying, dominant rumble of Vokkar's beast resonated beneath every word. She raised her hand. "Look at me." She snapped her fingers. The black fire on her dress violently whipped forward like a dozen vipers. It slammed into Kalen and the 2 guards nearest to him. There was no blood. There was no gore. The black flames simply washed over them, instantly consuming their life force. In the span of a single heartbeat, the Lord and his soldiers crumbled into pillars of silent gray ash. The ash collapsed onto the stone floor, blowing away in the unnatural, freezing wind circulating in the room. The remaining guards scrambled backward, scrambling up the stairs in absolute, blind terror. Thane remained pinned under the silver net against the wall. He stared at the piles of ash, then slowly looked up at the terrifying, unearthly entity standing in the center of the room. Naevia didn't look at him. The black flames receded, absorbing back into her skin. She slowly turned around, her bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. She walked back to Vokkar. He was still lying there, massive, pale, and completely lifeless. Naevia dropped to her knees. She placed her glowing, shadow-wreathed hand directly over his shattered chest. She could feel his golden soul trapped inside her own core, roaring, pacing, waiting. A terrifying, chilling smile crossed her face. "You broke the rules of death to stay with me," Naevia whispered to his corpse, her voice dripping with absolute possession. "So I am going to break the rest of them." She dug her glowing fingers into his shirt. Chapter 8. "You cannot do this." Thane's voice broke the freezing silence of the dungeon. He was leaning heavily against the stone wall, watching the girl bathed in black fire. "Watch me," Naevia replied without looking back. She pressed both of her glowing hands flat against Vokkar's ruined chest. "The laws of exchange are absolute," Thane warned, taking a limping step forward. "To pull an alpha soul back, you have to surrender the void. You will lose the crown. You will lose the immortality. You will become human, Naevia. And humans die." Naevia didn't look at him. A terrifying, hollow laugh vibrated from her throat. "I am not making an exchange," she whispered, her eyes turning entirely pitch black. "I am making a cage." She didn't surrender her magic. She weaponized it. Naevia screamed, slamming her palms down. She didn't push the void out of her body. She forcefully dragged Vokkar's lingering alpha ghost into it, violently welding his soul directly to the pitch-black core of her magic. The dungeon violently shook. The stone floor cracked beneath them. She was forcing a mutation. She was fusing the absolute light of an alpha king with the catastrophic darkness of a void queen. The pain was blinding, tearing her nervous system apart as the two opposing forces violently collided inside her chest. "Stay with me," she roared into the dead king's face, blood dripping from her nose. "You tied us together, now you don't get to leave." With a final devastating pulse of energy, she shoved the fused mutated spark directly back into Vokkar's heart. The shockwave blasted Thane off his feet. Naevia collapsed onto Vokkar's chest, her vision going completely black. For 5 agonizing seconds, the cell was dead silent. Then, a massive hand violently clamped around the back of Naevia's neck. A deafening gasp tore through the dungeon. Vokkar arched off the stone floor. His chest heaved as his lungs violently dragged in oxygen. The sickening sound of his ribs snapping back into place echoed against the walls. He didn't just wake up, he erupted. Vokkar rolled, instantly pinning Naevia beneath him, his fangs bared, his massive chest heaving. Naevia gasped, looking up at him. His eyes weren't just gold anymore. The glowing alpha irises were completely surrounded by the pitch-black void of her magic. And when Naevia raised her trembling hands, she saw the veins under her own skin pulsing with both purple shadows and liquid gold. They hadn't severed the parasitic bond. They had made it permanent. "What did you do?" Vokkar gritted out. His voice was a terrifying dual-layered rumble, the Alpha King and the Abyssal God speaking at once. "I kept you," Naevia breathed, a dark, exhausted smile touching her lips. "I kept the magic. I kept the bond. We share one pulse now, Vokkar. If my heart stops, yours stops. If you bleed, I bleed." Vokkar stared at her. His heightened senses swept over their bodies. He felt it, the absolute, suffocating, unbreakable tether between their souls. There was no escape. Not in this life, not in death. He didn't look grateful. He looked utterly, possessively insane. "You stupid, arrogant girl," Vokkar snarled, his fingers digging into her shoulders. "You corrupted yourself. You made us both monsters." "And you love it?" she challenged, wrapping her arms around his thick neck. "Tell me you don't love it." Vokkar's chest heaved. The sheer magnitude of her possessiveness, the fact that she had literally rewritten the laws of life and death just to trap him with her, forever shattered the last remnants of his sanity. "I am going to ruin you for this," Vokkar vowed fiercely. He didn't give her a chance to reply. He crashed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a soft romantic reunion. It was a violent, consuming collision. The shadows in the room violently whipped around them, reacting to the intense, suffocating heat of their mutated bond. It was toxic. It was codependent. It was perfect. Vokkar finally pulled back, resting his forehead against hers. His breath was ragged. "We are never letting each other go," he whispered, his black and gold eyes burning into hers. "Not even if the world begs us to." "Let the world burn," Naevia echoed his own words back to him. Vokkar stood up, lifting Naevia effortlessly into his arms. He didn't look weak. He radiated a catastrophic, apocalyptic energy. He glanced at Thane, who was slowly getting to his feet, staring at the two of them with undisguised horror. "Are the lords still upstairs?" Vokkar asked, his voice dead flat. "The ones who didn't run are barricading the Great Hall," Thane reported, his voice tight. "They think they can contain you." A cruel, chilling smile spread across Vokkar's face. He looked down at Naevia, the exact same smile mirrored on her lips. "Let's go show them who holds the leash," Vokkar commanded. He kicked the remnants of the dungeon doors aside and carried her up the spiral staircase. When Vokkar kicked open the heavy oak doors of the Great Hall, the remaining council lords drew their weapons, but the moment they saw the king and the girl in his arms, the weapons dropped from their trembling hands. The aura bleeding off the two of them was suffocating. It was the scent of absolute dominance mixed with the terror of the endless void. Vokkar didn't say a word to the lords. He walked straight through the center of the hall, the men scrambling out of his path like frightened rats. He reached the dais. He didn't sit on the obsidian throne. He gently set Naevia down on the iron seat. Then the alpha of alphas, the man born to be her executioner, turned his back to her and faced the terrified council. Vokkar didn't kneel to her. He didn't need to. He stood at the foot of her throne, a massive, unmovable shield of muscle, shadow, and gold. "The prophecy is fulfilled." Vokkar's voice boomed through the hall, echoing with the promise of absolute tyranny. "The lock and the monster are one. If any man in this room, or any army on this continent, dares to challenge my queen, Naevia leaned forward on the throne, her black eyes locking onto the trembling lords as she finished his sentence for him. We will show you what the end of the world really looks like.